is the time to worship. Come. Now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come, come, come. I love you, Lord, for your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your voice. You have led me through the fire, in darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Yes, I will sing of the goodness of God.
We are starting a brand new series, a teaching series here, starting a brand new series that you could tell from the opener. It's called not Amazing Grace, but Unsettling Grace. And it really comes off this thought here. I understand, and by the way, if you're a guest here today and you're not a Christ follower, and before I get into something, there's something that I should have done anyway. We have an honored guest, above all the rest of you honored guests today. We have a special honored guest today. And it's because yesterday she graduated from college. I'm going to embarrass her now. But really, you're not the specialty, okay? You know who the specialty is? Mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, right? Those are the people. You don't get through college just by yourself. In fact, you don't get anywhere in life just by yourself. And that's congratulate mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa. They're proud. And obviously, it's a major milestone, so congratulations to that. Give her a hand of applause. That's a big deal. We're honored to have you here this morning. And she graduated yesterday, fresh off the diploma trail. And so I know I was excited every time one of my kids graduated. And and I'm going to be more excited when my granddaughters grow up. And I don't want to grow up that fast, but we're excited for that. And I got off track a little bit doing that because I should have started with that. But in this series, we're going to talk about something that's important to us, because if you're here today and you don't believe in Jesus Christ, it's okay. It's not really, but we're not going to force it down you. You don't have to do anything crazy. Or if you're listening online to our broadcast, we're okay. We want you to listen in. But I understand when people tell me, who aren't Christians, that they don't believe in Jesus Christ. I do. I get it. What I don't understand, and stay with me here, what I don't understand is why someone wouldn't want to believe in Jesus Christ. There's a difference between the two if you didn't know that, right? When somebody says, I don't believe in Christianity, I don't believe in Jesus Christ, what are they missing? They're missing maybe some of the information they need. They're missing some of the facts. They're missing something they don't know. But when somebody says, I don't want it to be true, I don't even know where to deal with that, to be honest with you. Because the truth is, we like things that we're comfortable with and we think are valuable to our life. In fact, there's a quote, Blaise Pascal, famous scientist, he said this in one of his writings. He said, people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs. And think about this. I know these statements are a little hard, but people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of whatever they find attractive. Now, I'm one of those guys, I have to read something like that a couple, 2, 3 times. So I'm going to give you a second to think about that. But it's true, isn't it? We don't always arrive at the things we believe in because we had proof. We arrive because it was attractive. I mean, hey, if you ever wondered, like, you go out somewhere and you see somebody dressed sort of crazy, you're like, what were they thinking? That just proved my point, didn't it? It proved what Blaise Pascal was saying. You know, it was what they thought they found attractive. It wasn't that they had any facts that it really looked good. You know what I'm saying? That's the truth, though. But here historically, and I know history is being rewritten in our modern day America, but historically you realize our Western civilization was based on Christianity. That's true. Now, they are trying to rewrite that and change everything about our founding fathers and how our country was. But the truth of the matter is, because Christianity is the basis, we got to ask the question, why was Christianity so popular? Do you realize when Jesus Christ died on the cross, he was the hated man in the city of Jerusalem by the Jews and by the Romans? They both agreed to put him to death. What happened in the next 100 years is just amazing. Actually, the next 300 years, because Christianity went from being something that nobody would acknowledge. It was actually called, back then, they considered it to be a cult. Christianity went from that to being the actual state religion of the Roman Empire. It really did. Now, it was a different kind, but once again, Christianity changed places, and you got to ask why, and I'll tell you why. Because of one simple thing, a word called grace. And that's what we're going to talk about in this series. Because grace is what we most crave when our guilt is exposed, when you think about it. Now, think about that definition I just gave you. Grace is what we most crave when our guilt is exposed. See, when I am found out to have done something wrong, something bad, I have to admit something, what I want is grace. What I want is forgiveness. What I want is something I don't deserve. And that's what we like about that. So what we crave most when our guilt is exposed. And aren't you glad for that? The other thing about grace is the fact that grace is what we are hesitant to extend when confronted with the guilt of others. And that is the tough part right there. Right? Do you see the two things? It's what we're at odds with. It's what we most want when our guilt is exposed, but it's what we hate to give when we face the guilt of others. That's why there's somebody probably in your life that you won't talk to because they've done something that you cannot forgive. See, the tension in this series is the fact that we want grace for ourselves, but we don't want to extend grace to anybody else, and that's the truth. As we look at this, what we're going to see here, and this is the tension, grace is when we are on the receiving end is extraordinarily refreshing, and isn't it? The day I became a Christ follower, and it wasn't because I had been a capital murderer. It wasn't because I had this big, huge debt of sin that was so massively weighing on my soul. It was just because I was born into a corrupted life, because we're all sinners. But the day I met Jesus and started that relationship with him, you know what? I found that God's grace was extraordinarily refreshing. But grace, when it's required of us, is extraordinarily disturbing. And that's why we're talking about unsettling grace. Because grace in my life, once again, it is refreshing, but it's so hard to look at people that are so unlike me. And it's so hard for me to move down the idea and say, hey, you know what? This is what I want to give too. So let me give you a working definition of grace today. Grace is undeserved, and you probably have heard a lot of different definitions, but here for our series, this is what we're going to say. Grace is undeserved, unearned, and unearnable favor. That's just as simple as I can get. Undeserved, unearned, and unearnable favor. And what we have to realize about grace is a couple things that I want to point out that maybe you've never considered. First of all, grace can only be experienced in the context of a relationship. And it's not just any relationship. When we're talking about grace, I know it's one of those churchy words, but when we're talking about grace, and that's so important for us, it can only be experienced in in a context of relationship, and not just any relationship. It's only experienced in a context of relationship where where it's an imbalance, where you're on the dark side of the relationship. That means the scales are balanced towards evil, towards bad, and you owe more than you don't owe. That's the tough part. It's that negative side. That's the only time when you see grace needed, isn't it? See, if I was a perfect person, if I was a good person, if you are good, we would need grace, would we? Grace is only necessary in a relationship when I've done something bad, when I am on the negative side of the ledger. And this is why I believe, and this is why I'm so perplexed, why I can't understand why everybody wouldn't want Christianity to be true. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But it also is why God had to show up. When you think about this, we would never have known the grace of God without the presence of God. That's the truth. And here's what I mean. What you have to do is take yourself back to the New Testament times, Bible times. And this is so hard because we live in 21st century America. Things are so different. But Bible times, Jesus is on the scene. Nobody knows a whole lot about him, but he's taught about a bunch of things. But why is Jesus there? And John, who's our best writer, he comes up with some ideas for us and he helps us out with these things. But here's what you have to realize. Up to that point, every Israelite, every person who worshiped Jehovah, the God of the Bible, the Old Testament God, what they thought, and anytime they pictured him, they pictured one thing in mind. They pictured Mount Sinai with Moses at the top and all the people gathered at the base because they couldn't enter the mountain. They couldn't come on the mountain. And they pictured this God who came down in a huge, massive cloud with thunders and lightnings and a shaking of the ground, an earthquake, and he was terrifying. That's the God of the Old Testament. See, they pictured a God who told them that they weren't good enough and they need to keep all these rules that they couldn't keep. They pictured a God who said, you know what? If you talk back to your parents, kids, you should be taken out and stoned. If you steal, you should die. If you kill, you should die. If you covet, you should die. I mean, all these things, you're sitting back going, wow. There was over 600 rules they had to keep every day, and that's what they thought of God. They thought of him as this distant, powerful God who cared enough about them to help them through their day-to-day problems, but he was hard to know. They thought about a God who said, you know what? Go out and kill all the Canaanites because they're not living the way we want. Go out and slaughter people. Go out and tear down the whole city of Jericho. Those are things that trouble us when we sit back and we go, like, we're trying to put this loving God together with this God of the Old Testament, and that's the God. But remember what we just said, we would never have known grace without the presence of God. And that's exactly what John points out when he says this in John chapter 1, verse 14. He says the Word, that's another term for Jesus Christ, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. You know, Jesus came so that we could see what God would look like. See, up to the point of, and we miss this every Christmas, because we just celebrate this whole like cool nativity and we get caught up in the Christmas stuff. But the truth of the matter is John's telling us the Christmas story once again. He says, you know what? The Word of God, Jesus Christ, came because we didn't know him. Because all we saw was a God who was scary. We saw a God who had a list of rules. We saw a God who we felt hated us more than helped us. We didn't feel the love of God. We felt the power of God. That's why if you go through the Old Testament names of God, those names don't really get you connected sometimes. I mean, those names are cool names when you know what they mean, but they didn't really give you that relationship I want to go hug him kind of thing. They give you the, God's going to open up the earth and swallow me. God might send down fire and brimstone on me if I live wrong. And that's the view most of us have sometimes when we don't have that relationship. But John points out, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. We have seen his glory. John, do you realize who John is that's writing this? He's the best friend of Jesus. The self-acclaimed best friend. He always writes, throughout the gospel account that John writes there, he refers to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. I don't know if he meant that he didn't love the other ones the way he loved John, but it's a special favor, friend. And John says, hey, Jesus became God in the flesh because we've seen his glory. When did he see his glory? When he turned water into wine. When he raised Lazarus from the dead. When he healed the lame and the deaf. When he caused miracles to happen, things like the feeding of the 5,000 from just a boy's lunch. The feeding of the 4,000. We have seen his glory. This isn't secondhand information. John's given us firsthand. He said, I was there. He says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son. And what John wants us to see is there's God the Father, and now we see God in the flesh, God the Son, and he's come to show us something. And John finishes out the verse by saying, who came from the Father, and this is the important thing, full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. See, he didn't say sometimes he was full of grace and sometimes he was full of truth. He said he was all the time full of grace and truth. He wasn't the balance of grace and truth, because here's the problem. Whenever you try and balance grace and truth, some of the truth gets thrown out, some of the grace gets thrown out. In fact, here's an interesting thing. My dad was a pastor. I've been a Christian for most of my life. And here's what I know. If you go to most churches and visit churches, what you're going to find out is churches are one of two things. They're either churches that are all grace, or they're churches that are built on all truth. Okay? And here's the difference if you don't know this. A church that's all grace, they love everybody, but they sometimes forget the truth. And they mess up on the truth. And they let the truth slide. And we call them sort of like they're getting into some heresy and things like that. They do things that we're shocked at. They embrace things that, wow, they have forgotten the truth of God. Then there's the kind of churches I pretty much grew up in. They were all truth. And you know what the all truth churches do? They don't give a hoot about people, to be honest with you. They make a bunch of checklists of rules that you have to follow, you have to obey, and you have to keep up with. And if you don't do it exactly the way the preacher says, boy, you're not doing it right. They tell you how you should look, how you should dress. In fact, you go to those churches, you're going to find most of those churches, and you're going to be thankful for this one, that we're not. Most of those churches, the people, at least the men, look like the pastor. And you can say, thank God, this isn't happening here, okay? I understand. I'm follically challenged. I understand that. But you know what? Jesus wasn't that. He wasn't the balance. He didn't pick one or the other. Jesus, and this is so important that we understand this, Jesus was all grace and all truth. Not the balance of them, not when it needed at this and this. He was all grace and all truth all the time. He was. And that's probably the most important thing we know about him. You know, Jesus never wanted to water down the truth, and he never wanted to turn down the grace. He was all grace and all truth all the time. And that's why it's so important. And that's the other reason I sit back and say, man, I can't understand why people wouldn't want Christianity to be true. See, Jesus called sin, sin. He didn't make excuses. He called sinners, sinners. That was truth. But he also laid down his life for the sinner, and that is grace. He was all truth and all grace. When we think about this, probably the best story that helps us with this is over in Matthew. Matthew chapter 9. Matthew, the guy who's writing this, he writes the story of himself, how Jesus came to him one day. Now, before we get into the verses that are on the screen and we look at it in Matthew chapter 9, what I want you to know is this. Matthew was Jewish, but he was a tax collector. Worst person in Jewish culture is the tax collector. Nobody thought those guys to be good because they weren't. In fact, the Jewish tax collectors were thieves generally, and we know a guy named Zacchaeus. Most of us grew up in church, and we knew a guy named Zacchaeus, right? And he was a chief tax collector, and he wasn't a good guy. But the tax collectors were their whole different, separate group of people. They were not really favorable to the Jews because they stole from the Jews, and they loved the Romans because the Romans were making them wealthy. And so they did things that were despicable, and they hung out with each other. And so they were sort of cast out of the situations in life. They were not favorable. And Jesus comes one day, and he sees Matthew sitting. His name's Matthew or Levi. He sees Matthew sitting at a table collecting taxes. He was the local tax collector that day. He walks up to him and says, "Hey, Matthew, follow me. Be my disciple." And that is just so shocking because of who he is. And Matthew, without hesitation, gets up, leaves his job behind, his very lucrative job, and follows Jesus. But the first thing he does, and this is so cool, is Matthew arranges a party. Now, I don't know if Jesus said, "I want you to fix a party for me," but Matthew does. I don't know if it was a retirement party, like I'm no longer collecting taxes, I'm going to have a retirement party. Or it was just like, hey, a social thing he did all the time. But Matthew holds a party, and he invites all of his coworkers. So the party is filled with guys just like Matthew, who nobody liked. And Jesus was also there, and that's what's great. And at the party, though, because Jesus was there, the other disciples were there too, and they were standing outside because they were just new at this whole thing. Jesus is just starting his ministry, and along comes the Pharisees. Now, if you don't know who the Pharisees are, they are the religious zealots of the day. They're the guys that had all the rules. They would be the all-truth group, right? All truth, no grace. And so we pick up in Matthew chapter 9, and it says, when the Pharisees saw this, so what did they see? They saw Jesus in a party with publicans, sinners, tax collectors is the terms. And they ask his disciples, what do they ask his disciples? "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" To which Jesus said, "Oh my goodness, you shouldn't call them that. You shouldn't call them sinners. Don't you know you're going to offend them? Don't you know they might raise your taxes?" No, he didn't say that. He said, on hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need the doctor, but the sick." Now, maybe you just sort of glossed over that, but I want you to know, this is an awkward situation, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a party with some people, and some other people showed up and said, "Oh, I don't know about these people." And then you looked up and said, "What, those guys? I know they're jokers. I know they're bad people. I know they're sinners. I know they're sick." Jesus, in front of Matthew, the guy he said, "Hey, follow me," he's all truth and all grace. And he looks up and he says, "Hey, I know who Matthew is. Matthew and all of his friends are sinners." Jesus didn't shade the truth. You know what? You were in a room full of sinners. Matthew did not shade the truth. He told it exactly how it is. If you think because we clean up, maybe we dress nice and all that, or we come to church on Sunday that we're better people than the people outside this room, you're wrong. We're not. You know, the only difference is the word grace. It is. The grace of God. Because Jesus is going to call it how it is. He said, "These guys are sinners." How awkward it was. Can you imagine how the party went the rest of the night? I mean, they don't really record all that. But Jesus in front of everybody says, "Hey, you know what? They're sinners, but that's exactly who I came from. I didn't come for the healthy. I came for the sick." And Jesus acknowledged this whole issue. See, it's this layout that Jesus gives us for everyone to hear that's so amazing to us. And then Jesus, he stops and he gives the Pharisees a word. In the next verse, he says this, "But go and learn what this means." And he gives us this little quote inside of a quote. He's going to quote a verse out of Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. He says this, speaking of God, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Wow. And he just smacked the Pharisees in the face too. He told them how it was. And he wasn't doing it out of a mean spirit because he's balanced, remember? Because Jesus loved those Pharisees as much as he loved the sinners. as much as he loved Matthew and all the disciples, as much as he loved anybody. See, Jesus is saying, I'm not afraid to call a sinner, and I'm not afraid to go to their house for dinner. That's what Jesus is saying. He said, I want to make sure you got that. I am not afraid to call a sinner, but I'm also not afraid to go to their house for dinner. And Jesus, once again, what are we talking about? He was all grace and all truth all the time. And that sort of unsettles us a little bit, and we'll get to that in a minute. I'm reminded of another story, and I don't have this one for time's sake. I didn't want to get all the verses in there, but most of us know in John chapter 8, there's a story of a woman who's caught. Jesus is being set up by these same Pharisees once again because they hated him. It's early in the morning, and Jesus is on top of the mount, the Temple Mount. He's teaching early in the morning, and the Pharisees drag a woman who's stark naked in front of Jesus and throw her down. And they say, hey, Jesus, guess what? We caught her in the act of adultery. We caught her red-handed, and you know what the rules say, as they all have their big rocks in their hands. The rules say we're supposed to stone her. What do you say? And they thought they had him. And Jesus, remember, he's all grace and all truth all the time. He does something that shocks us. He forgives her and walks on, right? No. If you read that story, what you find is Jesus being all truth and all grace. What does he say? He tells them, hey, you know what? Whoever doesn't have any sin, you should go ahead and throw the first stone. And one by one, they all walk away. And then he looks at her and he says, hey, woman, where's your accusers? She says, they've gone. And he says, well, I don't accuse you either. Go and sin no more. And that's the grace and truth. Did you catch it? I don't accuse you either. That's grace, isn't it? I'm not going to hold you accountable for the laws of God. Because remember those Old Testament laws, the God that they saw in the Old Testament? He's God in the flesh. And he said, you know what? I know the law. I'm not erasing the law. We're not throwing it. I know people have a tendency to say, well, that's Old Testament. He's not saying that at all. He's saying, you know what? Because of grace, whose grace? My grace. As God Almighty, my grace, I am going to forgive you of this. And by the way, the truth that you need to hear today is stop sinning. And that's what Jesus would tell us too. Probably no greater story, though, than the last one I do want to look at is a story that Luke tells us in his gospel account. It's probably the greatest story because it's the story through the crucifixion. In Luke chapter 23, and we know this story as we just come from Easter not too long ago. Luke tells us in Luke chapter 23, verse 32, that two other, both criminals, and that's important. He didn't want to just embarrass these guys. I know in our culture today, we don't tell people, like, don't describe them. Luke's just being honest. Truth here. Two others, both criminals. And when we hear the word criminal, what we should understand is there's no hope for them. These were irredeemables. They didn't deserve grace. They didn't deserve anything. But isn't that the point of grace? Right? Grace isn't deserved. Why? It's like trying to throw yourself a surprise party. There's no surprise, right? When you deserve grace, there is no grace. Some of you guys are going to have to think on that one for a while. But the truth of the matter is, here we have, as it's described, two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him. That is Jesus to be executed in verse 32. We go to the next verse. It says, verse 33, when they came to the place called the skull, Golgotha, they crucified him there along with the criminals. One on his right, the other on his left. Now, so far the story is not surprising, right? Criminals, well, they get it, right? In fact, what is our biggest concern? You turn on the news and you watch a story on the news, are you horrified when you see somebody get off? He got away with it. You know he's guilty. How did he get away with it? Because we have this sense of, we think, we pat ourselves on our back because we have a sense of fairness, right? Grace isn't fair, you know that, right? They keep going, and Luke moves on in the story. He says the people stood watching. What were they watching? They were watching a crucifixion of Jesus who didn't deserve it, but these two criminals who did. And the people, remember, these are the same people that sent Jesus to the cross. The people stood watching. The rulers sneered at him, and they said, he saved others. Now, remember this. These are the Jewish leaders, the Romans, the Jewish citizens. These are the people that decided that grace in a body couldn't exist anymore. They had to kill him. And so they stood there watching to see what would happen. They stood there contemplating Jesus and what he was going to do. And they weren't concerned about those criminals because those criminals deserved it. But they said, he saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. If he is. We don't believe it. Why did they stand there? Because of that question. Remember I started off? I don't understand why anybody wouldn't want it to be true. They were asking that question in their own lives, weren't they? They wanted to see, according to the statement there, whether it was really true. Is he really God's Messiah? Is he really the chosen one? Is he really grace in the flesh, God come down in body? We know about him raising Lazarus from the tomb. We know about him healing the blind and the lame. We know about all those things. But is he really God in the flesh? Luke goes on to tell us a little bit more about the importance of the story. In verse 39, he says, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. And that's what we expect of him. But the other criminal rebuked him, saying, don't you fear God? Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence. Now, you have to understand what he's saying there. What he's telling us there. You know, he was saying there, his only hope was what he deserved least. Grace, wasn't it? He was saying that if heaven, if eternal life is for people who've done good in life, that we don't have a chance because we deserve it. See, in that scale of balance, he understood he wasn't a good person. That's the first step towards grace, isn't it? To understand, because remember what I said? Grace is a personal relationship, and it's an issue. And if you don't understand that you are on the deficit side of that relationship, then you don't need grace. This guy understood it. He said, you know what? We are hanging here because we deserve it. He doesn't, but we do. And that's the whole idea. He says, you need to shut your mouth because we're going to pay for this because we deserve it. We're under the same sentence. But in an act of desperation, this other criminal who's been told to be quiet, this criminal who's hanging there, who acknowledges the fact of grace that is necessary, but probably won't be given in his life because he understood that tension, right? It's what we most deserve, but it's what we least want to give, right? He didn't think he was going to get it because he didn't think anybody would give it. The crowd wasn't going to give it that day, was it? What did he say? He reached out with one thing of hope, and he said, Jesus, remember me. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me. Hey, you know what he was saying? I need grace in my life. Don't you? Do you remember the day when you asked for grace in your life? I remember the day I asked for grace in my life. It's clearer than most days. I woke up that morning. I was the son of a pastor. I knew more verses than most people. I'd gone to church. I was born in a nursery, I believe. There wasn't a day I didn't. I mean, we were always at church. Didn't mean I had a relationship with Jesus Christ. Things were piling up in my life, and it was my freshman year of high school. And I knew I had prayed prayers and things like that, but you know what I didn't have was a relationship with Jesus Christ. And you know what I said to Jesus that day? When I realized that the scales, I was on the bad end of those scales, that I wasn't a good person. I could dress up and people could think, I shocked a lot of people when I did this. But I remember I went up to the pastor of the church I was at, and I said, I need to get saved. And he said, no, you don't. I said, yeah. And I remember praying that prayer, Jesus, remember me. Jesus, remember me. You know what that prayer is? It's a prayer of, I need something in my life that I don't have. I'm deficient, and I can't get it from anybody else. And you don't have to give it, but I'm going to trust because you're the one person who could. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And then he adds two words to this guy. He says, Jesus, remember me in your kingdom. When he said, truly today, you'll be with me in paradise. In paradise. Today. Grace and truth. Now, that's a great story because God promised a man who could do nothing good and had nothing good to offer, he promised him that where I'm going, you're going to go too. And that doesn't make sense to us. Why would Jesus do this? Why would Jesus? Because he's God, I know is the answer. But the truth of the matter is, it must have been mind-boggling when he said those words to the crowd who was there, wondering what's going to happen. It must have blown his mind. See, inviting Matthew to follow and the woman who caught in adultery was one thing, but now you've got known criminals who have done despicable things, thieves, murderers. These were the guys who they deserve this. They're going to get treated better by God. That doesn't make any sense. But if you didn't remember, I said this. It doesn't make any sense because grace is not fair. Did you hear that? Grace is not fair, and that's why it's so unsettling to us. Grace is much better than fair. It is. Because fair wouldn't get us very far. See, if I got what was fair in life, I'd be hurting a lot worse. If you got what was fair in life, you'd be a lot worse. It's only by God's grace that we exist, and that's the truth. See, Jesus was all grace all the time because that's what love is. And John, that same guy who wrote his gospel account, he tells us over in his other letters, 1 John, he tells us that God is love. And when he says that, he ignites a whole new idea because we were always thinking God is power, God is might, God is scary, God is all these different things. He's holy, God is awesome, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. But the truth of the matter is, God is love. And you know what God is love does for us? When you say God is love, he's really saying that God is all grace and all truth all the time. And that's the whole idea. Now, the pushback. Maybe you're here and you're not a Christ follower. You're listening, you're not a Christ follower. Maybe you are a Christ follower and there's some pushback to what I've just taught you today. Obviously, it came from the Bible. I just showed you the verses. But the pushback for us, the pushback's simple. It's why we're not talking about amazing grace today. We're talking about unsettling grace, because isn't grace unsettling? It is. Because the question probably in your mind, the question I came up with right away is, was Jesus not concerned about justice? Doesn't that criminal deserve to go to hell? Doesn't he deserve what he's getting? Don't we all deserve that? Is Jesus not concerned with consequences in life? Is that something we should assume? No. In fact, I would tell you this. There was probably nobody better about knowing about consequences than Jesus. See, here's what Jesus knew. Jesus knew this, and this is so important for you, for me, and this is great. Jesus knew that God's justice would crush us. It would. That's what Romans is all about in Romans, the beginning of Romans. When Paul says in Romans that there's none righteous, no, not one. When he says that all are sinners and have come short of the glory of God, that's what Paul was expressing there. Jesus knew this very clearly. Jesus knew that anybody, he knew it better than anybody, that the consequences of sin were already crushing us. And yet, here's what is the truth. See, every sin has a gotcha, but Jesus came to get you. That's so simple, isn't it? Every sin has a gotcha, but Jesus came to get you because he's God in the flesh, grace, all truth, all the time. This is why I don't understand why everybody wouldn't want it to be true. Now, I understand versions of Christianity have gotten way off kilter, but I don't understand why everybody wouldn't want it to be true. See, here's the deal. Remember, we went to Blaise Pascal's quote way back at the beginning? And what did he say? People don't believe things because of proof. They believe things because they have a favorable response to them. Something they like, right? That was the paraphrase of that. Blaise Pascal was right, and you know what? The truth of the matter is, in the first century, Christianity was irresistible. You know why? Because they understood grace. And it was unsettling. It wasn't just amazing grace. It was unsettling grace. It was a grace that turned their world upside down. It was a grace that brought Matthew, a known tax collector, a sinner, to become a disciple of Jesus Christ. It was grace that took a woman caught in the very act of adultery and freed her from a certain death penalty, according to Jewish law. But more so, it was grace that took a thief on a cross and gave him not what he deserved, but gave him a chance in paradise. Jesus understood what the effects of sin would be. You know, when grace is on display, people will want it to be true. So it brings me that question, why aren't we doing a better job as Christians in the 21st century? Because grace has become so unsettling to us that we want people to get what they have coming to them, what they deserve. Remember what I told you at the beginning? The tension in grace is I want it for me, but I'm not so sure I want it for you. You know what? Jesus wants it for everybody. That's just the truth. In fact, over in Luke chapter 16, Jesus said this. He said the law and the prophets were proclaimed till John. And when he says John, he's talking about John the Baptist, another John. He says the law and the prophets were the law and the prophets were there until John. And what he's trying to get us to see is this time frame. And in this time frame, what we have in this time frame is Jesus, what he said, the law and the prophets, he's talking about up till John. John was the forerunner of Jesus. And so he's saying, hey, everything was running its course and there was no hope until what? Till I came. Since that time, so he changes up. Since that time, the good news, we call it the gospel, don't we? That's the same term. The good news of the kingdom is this, being preached and everyone is forcing their way into it. Now, that seems like such a weird thing to say. Everyone is forcing their way into it. You know what he's saying? When the good news is good to you, you're going to want it. You're going to do anything you can to get it. Do you realize the first church, those people who sat in their church, they weren't comfortable at all. They were uncomfortable because they were being persecuted. They were being martyred. They were being put to death. But still, they were growing and growing. In fact, there was a letter from one of the Roman bishops who was practicing worshiping the Roman deities. And he wrote to the emperor and he said, I don't understand these Christians. We do everything we can to stop them and they keep growing. And the emperor responded, who was Marcus Aurelius, he responded by saying this. He said, those Christians go out of their way to love one another. In fact, what's even more perplexing, they don't just love their own, they love our despicables, our despised, our less thans. That's how grace took over the world. That's how grace changed things. Because Christians love one another. They didn't come together and just sit back and do nothing. They went out and loved their neighbors who were nothing like them. See, Matthew, the woman taken in adultery, thief on the cross, were nothing like Jesus. Yet they loved and they liked Jesus. Why? Because of grace. Amazing grace, but unsettling grace. So what's the challenge for us today? I talked to a group of people that you've been in church for a long time. That's why you're here today. It's homecoming Sunday. If we're going to be active as Christians, if we're going to stop complaining about governments and economics and problems in the world today, if we're going to stop complaining about things like abortion and stuff like that, you know what's going to have to happen? Not more protests, not more political activity. None of those things are going to ever solve anything. You know what has to happen? Grace. Not just for you, but you're going to have to give it to people you don't like, who are nothing like you, nothing like Jesus. That's the challenge today. Let me have every head bowed and every eye closed. We talk about grace. What we're talking about is grace in one word, is Jesus Christ. Maybe you're listening, maybe you're here today, And just, by the way, let me just say this. When we talk about having this relationship with Jesus Christ, there's not a Baptist way, there's not a Methodist way, there's not a Presbyterian way. There's only one way. His name is Jesus Christ. And he's the one who gives us the grace to do what we need to do. So when we talk about grace today, I'm not talking about have you been baptized? Were you a member of Maple Springs? I know all those things are things we think about a lot. What I'm talking to you about today is not about church membership. It's not about attendance. It's not even about giving. Those are good things. You should do all those things. But those things won't get you to heaven. If no one's ever told you that, those things won't get you to heaven. It's that unsettling grace. Jesus offers it to you just like he offered it to those three that we talked about today. And it is unsettling because we don't deserve it. And what's hard, in order to get the grace you need, you have to come up and say, you know what? I'm not good. I don't deserve it. I'm on the dark side of the ledger. I've got some red in my ledger. But Jesus still says, hey, you know what? You can be with me today in paradise. If you don't know Jesus Christ as your Savior, that's what we're here for today. You may have thought, hey, I came to get a meal. That's cool. We're going to eat in a little while. You may have said, hey, I'm just here to honor my ancestors. That's cool too. We want to do that. Just a minute, we're going to go out to the cemetery. But the truth of the matter is, the only thing that really matters is your relationship with Jesus Christ. I'm not talking to you, tradition of church. I'm not talking, are you a Baptist? I'm talking to you, Jesus Christ. I'm not even asking, did you pray a prayer? Do you have a relationship is what I'm asking. So if you've never taken care of that today, today's the day. Today is the day. Don't put it off because you may not have another day. But I think you will because God's grace is everlasting. He wants it to be something for you. He didn't have to. He didn't have to die on the cross for you, but he did. You may have been mistreated by a pastor, a church, another Christian, and that's maybe, hey, I don't want to be one of those guys. I understand that too. I'm not asking you to give up that. What I'm saying is accept the guy who really loves you, who wants a relationship with you. The second aspect of our invitation today is for us as Christ followers. You know why churches are empty across America? You know why churches are in decline? It's not because we don't have cooler bands or better buildings or bigger budgets or anything else. It's not because we don't have Sunday school or we don't do it the way they used to do it 80 years ago. The truth of the matter is we've gotten away from that unsettling grace because we want it for us, but we don't want to give it to those people who aren't anything like us. There's somewhere in our minds, there's a sense of they deserve it. Those abortionists deserve it. Those homosexuals deserve it. But you forget you deserve it too. So as a Christian today, man, when was the last time somebody's eternal destiny broke your heart and you were willing to cry to God about it? When was the last time someone who is destined for hell, you broke down and you prayed for them? And then you did more than just pray. You talked to them about Jesus. You talked about that unsettling grace. If you haven't done that in a long time, maybe on this homecoming Sunday, maybe today's the day you need to break down and bow your heart before God. You can do it at your seat, but I tell you, the altar's a really good place to do it. So in just a moment, we're going to stand. We're going to sing a verse of invitation. You don't have to sing. We have people that will do that for you. We're going to sing about that amazing grace. But don't let the grace of God be wasted on you by you just sitting there doing nothing again. Let God's grace penetrate your heart and get to the place where it's so unsettling that you've got to do something about it. You don't deserve it. You didn't earn it, and you can't earn it. That's why it's grace. God, we thank you for your amazing, unsettling grace this morning, and we help us as we go through this series to understand the problems we have in our lives, why we're not reaching people for you because of the grace factor in our lives. So God, help us to want it for us, but more so want it for the people around us too. Even the ones that we know to be sinners, that are nothing like you. Because people who are nothing like you, they liked you all the time, and you had an impact on them. So God, help us to have an impact on our community, on the people here today, the people that are around us at our work, our play, at school, our jobs. God, help us to be more like you. Deal with the hearts of the people that are listening today, and help your Holy Spirit to have impact in their lives. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand. We're going to sing a verse of invitation. I don't do long invitations, so if you need to do something with God, the altars are open. Tracy and I are both here. If you need to get a hold of somebody to talk to, we'd love to. As we sing.
How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me, and like a